We think of Shakespeare as a product of Stratford-on-Avon, but should we instead be thinking of Shakespeare of London? So I've been looking at some documents at the London Archives and the National Archives, which show us for the first time exactly where the London property that Shakespeare owned was located and also what its dimensions were. When we think of Shakespeare, we tend to think about him as a Stratford playwright. Ben Jonson, in the first collected works of Shakespeare in 1623, famously refers to him as the sweet swan of Avon, and people have tended to sort of follow that pattern. But we know that he works in London over a really long period, from the late 1580s, early 1590s through to the 16 teens. And we know various places where he lodged in London. So I was doing a lot of research on the precinct of the Blackfriars, what was surrounding the playhouse, the patterns of property ownership, who was living there. And I was in the London Archives doing some of this work and ordered up 2 boxes of documents relating to property ownership in the Blackfriars, and one of them had this plan attached to it which shows what part of the Blackfriars looked like a few years after the Great Fire of London in 1668. And it really shows you the ruins in some ways. It shows you what was left of the foundations, and it marks who was occupying them at that particular point in the late 1660s. We're walking from King's to the Blackfriars to see where Shakespeare's London property was located, and we're standing in front of Middle Temple Hall, which is where Twelfth Night was performed in February 1602. This wasn't the first performance of Twelfth Night. It would have premiered at the Globe in the autumn, but this would have been a showcase performance for Shakespeare's company to perform in front of a potentially influential audience. We're in the old monastery precinct of the Blackfriars. If we were here in Shakespeare's day, we'd see some buildings which have been here since the medieval period, which would have been converted into various uses. Behind me is Apothecaries Hall. This dates from after the Great Fire of London, but it's on the site of an earlier hall, which itself was converted from some buildings that had a playhouse in the 1570s and 1580s. So when Shakespeare first comes to London, and for most of the time that he's working in London, he's living in rented property. So we know that he's in a parish called St Helens Bishopsgate in the 1590s. We know that in 1604 he's living on Silver Street, which is near where the Barbican is now, which was owned by a family called the Mountjoys. But he doesn't seem to have invested in London property, London residential property, until 1613. Up until that point, he's buying property in Stratford. So he buys really substantial, like, family house in Stratford, new place. But in 1613, something seems to shift. And it's possible that it's a business opportunity. So he's seeing it as something that he can lease out. He's seeing it as something that he can leave to his daughters. And eventually he leaves it to his older daughter, Susanna Hall. We're on the eastern edge of the Blackfriars precinct. To my right over here is St Andrew's Hill, which in the 17th century was known as Puddle Dock Hill. And behind me is the Cockpit pub. In the 17th century, part of this site was known as the Sign of the Cock. And I'm looking at the site of Shakespeare's house in the Blackfriars. So in front of me is part of Island Yard, stretching around onto St Andrew's Hill, and the bottom of Bergen Street. And Shakespeare's property would have stretched into what's now 5 Bergen Street. So it really kind of takes us through the 17th century, from the point where Shakespeare's still active in the theatre, through the point where he dies and he leaves it to his daughter, through the point where his granddaughter inherits it, and then right through to the point at which it's destroyed in the Great Fire of London. So in some ways, Shakespeare's Blackfriars residence has been a sort of hidden mystery in some ways, that questions have survived around it, but because we've assumed that there wasn't much more evidence to gather about it, those questions have kind of laid a little bit silent for a while. On the 10th of March 1613, William Shakespeare purchased lodgings in the Blackfriars Gatehouse located near this site. The documents that I've been looking at in the London Archives and the National Archives enable us now to say that it was not just located near this site, but precisely on this site.